welcome to Optimum Solutions Educational Webinars. My name is Susan Warren, and I'm a member of Optimum Solutions support team. I'll be your host for the educational webinars. For our educational webinars, we've selected topics that we think will be of interest to payroll and HR professionals, and we hope you learn lots of useful tips from watching our educational webinars. If you think of other subjects that you'd like to see presented, please email me at swarren@optimumhris.com. Thanks for watching and enjoy the webinar.
Welcome to Optimum Solutions webinar about record keeping and record retention. My name is Susan Warren, and I'll be your presenter today. And I'm going to be upfront and perfectly honest with you. Today's topic is not terribly exciting or sexy. It's not going to keep you on the edge of your seat, but it is information that you have to know if you don't want to pay penalties or go to jail. So, okay, maybe it is a little exciting. Here's our agenda for the day. We're going to look at what the Fair Labor Standards Act has to say about record keeping, and that's a lot. We will look at what the Internal Revenue Code has to say about how you keep records related to the taxes that you withhold and pay. We'll also look at federal and state unemployment laws and how they want you to keep records. Same with state wage and hour. Unclaimed wages, or escheat wages, we'll look at how you keep records on those. Keeping records for direct deposit authorizations. And then we're going to look at the big picture, the overall record retention procedures that you need to have in place. And we will very briefly touch on HIPAA. So before you ask the burning question, why bother with all this confusing mess? Why don't I just keep everything forever? Let me explain how a Department of Labor or a wage and hour audit works. They will come in and ask to see XYZ records. If you have those records from the time of Methuselah, there is a much greater chance that somewhere in the last 5,000 years, someone has made an error or two. And whatever records you present to the auditors, they will examine. Now, if you only have the records that they are asking for from the last 3 or 4 years, whatever the law requires for the records they want, it's much more likely that you'll present more accurate and compliant records and run a much lower risk of facing penalties. So let's just dive right in and get to the meat of the matter. So that you know what you're looking at, I have put in red at the top of these screens the number of years required for retention of the records referred to on the screens. And I'm not going to read all of these screens to you. They're just bullet points of items that you'll need to keep. I'll send all of you the presentation, and you can also view it on our website later. But I'm going to point out some highlights and add some information to the things that we have listed here. The Fair Labor Standard Act sets record-keeping rules for a lot of the information that you keep in your employee master file, like name, address, social security number, date of birth, that kind of information, and also your payroll history files, like the employee's rate of pay, particularly when it comes to calculating overtime, how many hours they worked each day in the work week, and so forth. We tend to think of FLSA as setting the rules for overtime, but actually a tremendous amount of your record keeping and retention rules are set by FLSA. A lot of the FLSA information is kept for 3 years, especially your employee master file information and your pay period information. This screen refers to straight time, overtime, additions and deductions from pay, and the total wages and the date of those payments. The 3-year rule also applies to union contracts and certificates for special kinds of employees. Time cards and substantiating data carry a 2-year retention rule, and anything related to time cards. Now, I want to take this opportunity to let you know there is no FLSA requirement that employees or supervisors have to sign or approve their time cards. So that is not part of your record-keeping requirements. If you want to set up such a rule, that requirement would be entirely up to your company, that it's nothing that's required in an audit. There is a 3-year rule that's going to apply to the next several screens. 3 years would be the length of time you'd need to keep wage rate tables and time schedules. So basically you're saying he made $10 an hour at 40 hours a week, so we paid him $400. This is so you can prove how you paid an employee was correct. Now, for your exempt white-collar, usually salaried employees, you don't have to keep the same kind of rate of pay records on those exempt white-collar employees like you do on hourly employees, but you do still have to record the basis on which their wages are paid so that later, if you're audited, you can easily prove how you calculated the employee's wages, like a salary of $1,000 per weekly pay period. Now, also remember that your states may have more stringent rules for these employees' records retention, and what we're covering today is based on federal laws. So you might want to check with your states as well. If you are paying hospital employees who work 14 consecutive days, for 3 years, you must keep records of the time and day that that 14-day period begins, how many hours they worked each day of the 14-day period, what was straight time and what was overtime paid in each 14-day period. And you also have to keep a copy of the document that shows that you and the employee agreed to a 14-day work period. For tipped employees, there are some extra requirements. So you need to keep your notes that show how you used the tip credit, if you do that, to determine the employee's wages. And you also need to keep the employee's reported tips for 3 years. If you have any industrial home workers, and that would be something like a cottage industry, where you've got a group of people who work at home and maybe make jewelry or something for you. Keep the detailed records on those employees for 3 years so that you could go back and calculate their wages, how many pieces they created, and if you paid them by the piece. You just want to have enough detail so that you can go back 3 years later and recalculate, prove those wages. And if you're paying any employees for time spent on remedial education, also be careful in recording those hours and wages. Now, it's not very common, but for some young workers, you are allowed to pay wages lower than minimum wage. And if you do this, there are some special record-keeping requirements. First of all, you have to get permission from the Department of Labor to do this. So you have to keep that special permit and also keep the details regarding those employees' pay for 3 years. FLSA does not lay out exactly how you are to keep these records, just that you must keep them and that they must be accurate, complete, and in an audit, they must be able to be understood. You can use microfilm or microfiche, but if you do that, you also have to provide the equipment necessary to read the records. You can keep records electronically. You can keep them on-site or off-site, but they must be available for inspection within 72 hours of notice. If you fail to keep the required records or accidentally lose or destroy them, there can be statutory penalties. Now, I've seen auditors who will make allowances in the cases of natural disaster where records were lost. But if employees file suits against you and claim that you did not pay them properly, and if you do not have records to substantiate how you arrived at your calculations, the court almost always sides in favor of the employee, even if the employee is not able to specifically identify the hours or days when he or she worked overtime. So you need to keep your records and be able to prove your case. The same record-keeping rules apply for government contractors, and separate logs of job-related injuries and illnesses must be kept for 5 years. FLSA is not the only federal legislation that has something to say about record keeping. The Internal Revenue Code has a lot to say, primarily about how long to keep records related to the taxes you calculated and paid over for your employees. Of course, Form W-4 is very important because that's the basis for the federal income tax that you withhold for each pay period. Tips, third-party sick pay, and fringe benefits all also have an impact on tax calculations. And I'll go way back in time and I'll tell you the tip that I was taught years ago for record retention on taxes. The first tax form that an employee fills out is a W-4, so you keep tax records for 4 years. And that holds true pretty much for all the tax records. So a way to remember, tax forms, W-4, 4 years. Special withholding methods or tax settlements should be recorded for 4 years after the return period. Tax forms and returns should be kept for 4 years. You also want to keep proof of tax deposits and annuity and pension plan payments for 4 years because they also have an impact on your taxes. They're pre-tax deductions almost always. And just to clarify, keep at least 4 years after the due date of the tax for the return period to which the records relate. That's what they mean by 4 years. For taxes paid by employees, keep the information for at least 4 years after the due date of the employee's personal tax return. That would be April the 15th. Now, for those of you who are Optimum Solutions customers, this is your year-end save. Our year-end process walks you through a step to do a year-end save. Keep that for 4 years. Also, if the employer files a claim for refund, credit, or abatement of withheld income tax, keep those records for at least 4 years after the filing date of your claim. And just to keep you on your toes, information related to allocated tips, the 8027 form, only has to be kept for 3 years after the due date of the return to which they relate. For your pre-tax deductions, like your cafeteria plans, You'll need to hold on to that documentation for as long as needed to determine whether the plan meets the requirements for exclusion from income. So for your cafeteria plans, you might need to hold on to those documents longer than the 3 years, just as long as you feel necessary so that you could go back and prove those calculations in the future. FUTA records, federal unemployment, including Form 940, another tax form. Keep these records for 4 years from the date that the FUTA tax was paid. Now, when you start talking about unemployment records, both state and federal, there's a fine line between payroll and HR, and an even finer line with today's integrated databases and shared services. So for these next few screens, you may think, oh, that's something that HR takes care of. But actually, both payroll and HR need to know the rules about the things that are related to federal unemployment and state unemployment laws. For actions related to disabilities, keep records for at least 1 year. For age discrimination cases, keep the information for 3 years. And payroll and HR both need to understand these rules because, as you can see on this screen, it's information that's in your employee master file: name, address, date of birth, pay rate, compensation. So it's in your employee master file and your pay history files. General record retention rules to apply to applicants and employee information related to age discrimination includes any applications or resumes that you receive, information related to promotions, demotions or transfers, job changes, anything dealing with employment agencies, any tests or physical exams that you administer before you hire someone, job advertisements for open positions, and copies of those benefit plans. Keep all of those for at least 1 year. Forms I-9 should be kept for at least 3 years after the date of hire or 1 year after the date of termination, whichever is later. Family Medical Leave Act information should be kept for at least 3 years. And that kind of goes along with the pay information because it's having to do with absences that the employees may not have been paid for. Affordable Care Act forms should be kept for at least 3 years from the due date of the ACA returns. Now, states do have different record retention limits, but they generally all require this is the information that they want you to keep. And again, it's information from your employee master file: name, social security number, employee dates, date of hire, termination, rehire, and then your pay history information, the amounts of compensation for each pay period, those pay period beginning and ending dates, as well as check dates, and then dates and reasons for termination, and any time lost because the employee wasn't available for work. I've got a couple of tables to show you. They do explain the retention periods for each state. This is a big chart with columns on each side, and this is the top of the chart. The left side goes from Alabama to Iowa, and then the right side from Montana to South Carolina. This may be kind of small for you to see on your PowerPoint screen through the GoToWebinar, but it'll be bigger for you to see when I send you the handout. And here's the bottom part of that chart with the rest of the states. So the states have different lengths of time for you to retain this state unemployment insurance information. You want to check this table, see what your state requires. And state wage and hour is the same sort of method. Each state differs, but they generally require the same sorts of information that you'll find in your employee master file: name, address, the position that the employee works, and then your pay history information, how many hours they worked each day and week, their compensation information, the rate of pay, and if the employee is a minor, state wage and hour is going to be interested in their age. And I have a table. This is one big table with all of the state wage and hour record retention requirements listed here. Again, this may be small for you to see on your webinar, but I will send this to you. You can see that some states have no provision for record retention, so you can set your own rules. New York and New Jersey go up to 6 years, so you might want to set yourself a 6-year rule just to err on the side of conservatism. Child supports and garnishments carry no specific retention rules, but you should keep these records at least 3 years after the date of the last withholding. Again, so that you could substantiate any calculations you made for at least 3 years after the last withholding was made. And that brings us to unclaimed wages, or S-cheat wages. When you pay an employee and mail them their check, their last check, and they never claim it, they don't ever cash that check, and it gets returned to you. Hopefully you're not voiding that check and putting it back into your cash account. You do have to hold on to those wages and eventually turn them over to your state treasury. But you also have to keep the records related to those S-cheat wages, and different states have different requirements. And here is the top part of the table. You can see S-cheat wage records have to be maintained for kind of a long time. A lot of the states go as far as 10 years for maintaining the records for S-cheat wages. And here's the bottom part of that table. Now, this is not how long you hold on to the unclaimed wages. This is how long you retain the records related to the unclaimed wages. For direct deposit authorizations, when you have a new hire or even someone who's been with you for a long time and they give you a direct deposit authorization, you have to keep that piece of paper for 2 years from the termination or revocation of the authorization. So if the employee leaves you or stops the direct deposit, you still have to hold on to their authorization for 2 years from the last time you made their direct deposit. Well, my head is spinning, and I knew what I was going to say before we got started. So you must really be gobsmacked. But knowing the 2 years and 3 years and 4-year rules, that's just a tiny part of the whole picture. You have to have some plan for gathering your information, getting it into your records, maintaining it, then getting to it if you need it later, and ultimately safely getting rid of it when it's time to let it go. And we didn't even talk about secure destruction. That's a topic for another day, but it is something that you need to make sure is part of your plan. So you do need to establish a process and hopefully a written procedure for all the steps in your record retention procedures. And speaking of a topic for another day, there's one more part of your employee record that requires special handling, and that is HIPAA. I'm sure that you all know that the HIPAA record is part of the employee master file that has to be kept separately. And I just wanted to remind you that it's while it's technically part of the employee file, it does have its own set of record keeping and retention requirements. And we're not really going to cover that in today's webinar. I just want you to know that it's got its own very specific rules and regulations, separate and apart from the record keeping and retention that we've talked about today, which mostly has to do with payroll and taxes. So again, that's a topic for another webinar. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you have a refreshed list of what records to keep and how long to keep them so that you can be in perfect compliance. And what we really hope is that you don't get audited and have to prove these calculations for an auditor. But if you do, you should be able to do that with no problem. Please be on the lookout for more of our educational webinars soon. And please email me if you have any suggestions for webinar topics you'd like to see in the future. Have an optimum day.